The 1950s. A time of poodle skirts, rock and roll, and a sprinkling of Cold War paranoia. Now enter McCarthyism. Nope, McCarthyism wasn't a popular dance craze, but rather a witch hunt heavily rooted in political agenda and favors. All spearheaded by our main man, Senator Joseph McCarthy. And they were hunting communists, so they say. Why? Well, the Cold War had everyone a bit jumpy. The Red Scare, fears of Soviet espionage, nuclear Armageddon, it was all a bit dramatic. But how did Tinseltown get dragged into this mess? Let's set the scene. Hollywood, land of dreams. But in the 1950s, also the land of subpoenas. Yep, the House Un-American Activities Committee thought Hollywood was going all red under its bed. Stars, writers, directors, no one was safe. Many were called to testify. Were they now, or were they ever a communist? Some admitted past affiliations, while others, like the Hollywood 10, stood their ground, defending their First Amendment rights. Their prize, contempt of Congress and jail time. And then came the Blacklist. No, not the TV show starring the delightful James Spader. This was Hollywood's very own naughty list. But instead of missing out on Christmas gift, blacklisted professionals couldn't find work. Their careers? Virtually obliterated. But Hollywood is a crafty place. Some wrote under pseudonyms, like Dalton Trumbo, who even won Oscars under a fake name for movies like Spartacus. Talk about ghostwriting. Here's a little-known, not-so-fun fact about McCarthyism. Did you know that legendary actor Charlie Chaplin was accused of communist ties? The little tramp had to take a little trip out of the country. So what's McCarthy's legacy in Hollywood? A reminder of a time when fear clouded judgment and cost many their livelihoods. But it also showed Hollywood's resilience. McCarthyism eventually lost steam, especially after McCarthy's own antics got him censured by the Senate. The Blacklist was a dark chapter, but it also sparked vital debates on civil liberties, freedom of expression, and the dangers of unchecked power. Guys, welcome. We're doing something new here on Snobs Film History, and I invited my buddy Dan Master Shake, who you know, or if maybe you're new to the show, you don't know. Well, this is Dan Master Shake. We are going to talk about McCarthyism. This man is one of the smartest guys I know. He's a teacher. He's so well read. He's an author. Everything else in between. I'm not doing him justice by the words I'm using. So, Dan, why don't you tell him a little bit about yourself, and then let's get into it, sir.
Absolutely. Pumped to be here, Mick. I love talking about this era. I taught English at really all levels from 6th all the way to 12th grade for 15 years. And anytime I was teaching, generally 10th grade is when I did this. I did it a couple of times with freshmen too, but generally 10th grade, we did a whole unit on the Red Scare, McCarthyism, the time period that really that matters in terms of this really is 1945 to about 1957. There's stuff that happens before 1945 and the stuff that happens after 1957, but really that time period of just after the end of World War II and just before the Vietnam War really is the time period that matters in terms of it. So I'm excited to discuss some points with you and help out in any way I can.
I appreciate that, man. And learning is all the name of the game. And I love doing this with history. You know so much. And among my research, I love that you put it that way. I love that you gave those years, because those were the big years. Everybody was really being hit at that moment. But I want to point out to everybody watching, the House Un-American Activities Committee stayed until 1975.
Yep. I mean, that's it. It really I got down here in my notes really about it stuck around forever. The key moment where, as far as Hollywood goes, people really stopped worrying about it as much was Spartacus in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
So Dalton Trumbo wrote Spartacus, and he was a blacklisted writer. He was in McCarthy's book, and him writing that movie, and it was such a big production. It was such an epic. That was kind of like the beginning of the end, So HUAC, what really kind of might scare you a little bit is it's not that HUAC disappeared so much as it wasn't an official committee within our legislation body anymore. But in terms of what you would say HUAC is and what it does, it still survives in a certain extent in terms of different kinds of committees that exist. because that's really the HUAC was a to a certain extent a revolving door of a committee that took place in our legislative body. And so there's a lot of people that served on this committee off and on throughout the years. You know, that time period that I gave, like post World War II all the way to right before Vietnam, was when Joseph McCarthy really held sway.
Mhm.
But I mean, you're right. Like it started in 1938. It went on until 1975. It's just that core time period was when it really suppressed voices in Hollywood because they were scared that they potentially held communist tendencies.
Yeah, and now I think a big thing that, like, through my research that was real to me that maybe you can shine some light on for me is, I guess a lot of people were attending communist parties. Of course, it wasn't illegal to do so, and it was more about workers' rights and things like that at the time, which in the Depression was a very important thing to deal with and what people were going through. So I could see why. You know, as Cold War kids, I think you hear communism and you're like, let's beat them up. Let's just go after them. But the fact of the matter is, when you're suffering and you've got nothing and your work is not there or you're not getting the right rights, like, I could see people just attending the party to see. So is that how it was? Like, a lot of people were attending at certain times?
In the late 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Socialist Party was carrying a certain amount of power, that more so than ever, whether you call it socialism, Marxism, but it can't be confused. Don't confuse, like a lot of people do. They confuse Marxism and socialism with communism. It's different. In terms of what you would call the Socialist Party that took place in the 1930s, it really was about workers' rights. It really was about unionization. It really was about protecting people. And you see this idea of un-American activities rise, not solely because of the Socialist Party, but also because of the rise of nationalism.
Mhm.
And so socialism was seen as the other. So people weren't afraid. Like, now you say socialism and you have a certain population that is just petrified. They immediately think that you're going to start burning flags, locking people up in camps, like that, all that stuff. While in the 1930s, this was carrying about 8 to 10% of the population. This was not a small percentage.
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much of fear of the socialism. It was a lot more a fear of the other. And because all of the ideas of socialism were coming from this kind of, like, you know, post World War I Europe that was kind of like really soft on what became communism in Russia. This was seen as, like, people kind of forget, in the 1920s, communism in Russia was seen as this is a potential way forward. They found a level of success all the way until the end of World War II in Russia with communism that was, like, unheard of. So,
well, can I sorry, just to interject, because I want to know something about what you're just saying.
Yep.
Just a quick question. What was now I understand power came in and who came in to do it, but who would you attribute to the communism in Russia working at the time?
To a certain extent, you know, you see these competing factions. If you've ever read Animal Farm by George Orwell,
Mhm.
it does a great job of exploring the early successes. Now, it does it through this metaphor of the animals on the farm and everything, but early successes really were because of the focus on workers. To a certain extent, Trotsky should get a lot of that credit, because while Stalin, and not a lot of people know this, but Stalin was a former educator, so kind of gives a bad rap there. But Stalin focused a lot more on education and channeling youth into a pseudo military kind of mindset. And Trotsky, kind of who represent the other half of Lenin, so to speak, Trotsky really represented this idea of the workers. Well, they ran Trotsky out on a rail. They sent him to South America in 1925, and Stalin rose to solo power at that. So what you see really is early successes coming from this focus on workers and trying to return it. I mean, on paper, it sounded great.
Yeah.
So then that's why in the United States, when we hit the Great Depression, and especially post 1932, you see this rise of socialism. It's like, wait a second, like, people are starving and 14% of America is out of work. And so it was like, it was a soft sell for people. So the HUAC, and when it was formed and starting to investigate people, it was more about a fear of the other and the radicalism associated, and not nearly as much as the political ideology. You don't see the fear of the political ideology come until post 1945, when we're like, no, communism bad, and that's because of Russia. So that's in terms of the time period, that's the segmenting and the differences. You have 7 years where it's really more of a fear of the radicalism associated with it than the actual party itself. Now, the Socialist Party died out completely in 1940 to 1944 here in the United States. They lost all power in large part because of FDR.
Really?
And FDR might have been a not so hidden soft socialist. Yeah, that in large part, a lot of the stuff that FDR did, and he's not my favorite president. I'm not going to lie to this. Okay, he abused executive power. He went out of his way. Like you have it. He's the closest thing we probably ever had to a king. He's the only person to ever served more than 2 consecutive terms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right?
Yeah.
He very, very much so was a soft socialist. And so I think what you saw was like, it's wait a second, and like FDR can embody these ideas. And so they lost power because they were left with only the radicals, so to speak, because the more center left people kind of piled on with FDR. And so socialism died out right around 1942 to 1944. And they ran out of money because everybody voted for FDR.
Yeah. Holy crap. That's crazy. I did not know that. That's a
know
cool
way too
tidbit.
much about this time period.
So I know when we talked about the H.U.A.C. And how you told me it started as to weed out spies during the war.
Yep.
And then when Joseph McCarthy comes in, he takes it to really almost gain power and just take down the media and Hollywood and such, because he was going after many news outlets too, right?
So early on, he started, here you have the senator from Wisconsin who was essentially rising to power overnight. I mean, this is like an ascension that the only comparable ascension I would say is somebody like former President Obama. Former President Obama, 2 years as a junior senator, and suddenly he's running for president. You see Joseph McCarthy almost overnight garner this level of power because he reveals that he has names of people that are a threat. And of course, all these names happen to be people that he doesn't like, and they happen to be, and it kind of stirred up this fervor. That gave him a level of power that was easily spent, because you see him burn out within 3 years because he starts to accuse people that were his allies solely because they were no longer just saying yes, Joe, to everything that he said. And so it'd be like, if you and I are friends, we have a disagreement. I'm like, well, I heard Mick Manhattan was at a communist meeting in his neighborhood last week from my aunt, and his name is in my book too. And you're like, wait a second, dude, you and I have been going at the other part though is like, up until then, he was supremely popular, and the HUAC stayed popular well until, like I said, 1960. Joseph McCarthy is like this little snapshot of it, and probably the most powerful version, because he was really funneling these names to that committee. But I mean, that's a snapshot of it. So I mean, McCarthy is very important. It's called McCarthyism because it was carried out after, but they didn't call it McCarthyism at the time.
No, I guess at the time it was just
they didn't call it McCarthyism until much later, because it was seen as this like catalyst. He was a catalyst, and by the time he's out of power, he's still there. He stayed a senator for a long time. They kept voting for him again. But by the time he's no longer a figurehead, the HUAC is still going on and still investigating people. A great version of this actually happens in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is a metaphor for the entire period. So Arthur Miller was a blacklisted writer in Hollywood, and nobody would give him work. So he writes The Crucible, which is this whole play that on the surface is about the Salem witch trials. Yeah. But if you read it, it's actually about this time period. And at the end of the play, the people who at the beginning of the play had a ton of power no longer have power anymore, in large part because the people who siphon power away from them have kind of shoved them off to the side. At the end towards the end of the last act of the play, the person who starts accusing people runs away with a bunch of money.
You know what? I mean, it's been a long time since I've even read that.
Of course, I can't remember the characters' names off the top of my head. But that's supposed to represent Joseph McCarthy kind of absconding, even though he was to blame for a lot of this hysteria. He absconds and doesn't take part in any of these committees 1954 all the way to 1960. Like he's not. Yeah. And a great comparison in terms of this, like, you guys are all about films and the scene snobs, everything. A great comparison between the kind of hysteria that took place is to watch The Crucible and then compare it with something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I think it's 1957, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like those are two takes on hysteria that took place during the Red Scare. And you'll see in Invasion of the Body Snatcher, it's like, no, there is something to be afraid. That's the whole point of the movie. Like they're here already. And he says it at the end. Like, and of course they're in California. They're in the middle of like labor strikes. You see Cesar Chavez in the late 1950s rise to power and try to unionize fruit farmers. They even have this whole thing about like a farm at the end of the movie where all of the like snatchers are being born. You compare that with something like The Crucible, written in 1954, and you have this sheer comparison of like, there's nothing to be afraid of, and there's everything to be afraid. This was a true time period, the 1950s, and you really couldn't embody any kind of sentiment that wasn't pro-American, that wasn't pro nationalism. You could not do this out loud in the United States at that time, because you would have been, if you were a prominent figure, HUAC would have investigated you, whether you're in Joseph McCarthy's book or not, which, I mean, nobody was in the book. Or locally, often like, so if you and I are part of the same GM plant in Detroit and you hear I'm harboring unionized tendencies, this is before the rise of UAW and stuff. So you're like, wait a second, you're pro-union? Suddenly you're not going to have a beer with me anymore after work. You're not going to stop at the gin mill with me. You're going to be like, oh, that guy? I don't want any part to do with that guy. So there's from all the way to the microcosm of it to the macro in terms of the HUAC, you see all kinds of this hysteria taking place. And those two films, I think, are great gestalts, like big pictures of what was going on the two camps. You had people saying there's nothing to be afraid of, and you had people saying there's everything to be afraid of.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that too, because it's one of the other most famous, probably arguably one of the most famous Westerns. I was watching it last night. It came up as I was getting ready, High Noon.
High Noon. And it's that in terms of what takes place in that film as well. Yeah, you see, and they even take it so far as they code the hats, the black hat versus the white hat. You and I have commiserated about this before. If you didn't look, sound, and act like John Wayne, you must not be American. Wait a second, you're not eating a hearty red meat steak with potatoes and good old-fashioned gravy on it? Well, by God, you must not be American. You're not saying your prayers. You're not going to church on Sunday. Like a good example of the same kind of hysteria, if you like, you've seen it, I know that, but if the fans want to check it out, comes with that episode of The Twilight Zone, Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. That's another.
Oh, I love that one. I played Don in the play.
Oh, so like I've used that as well in this unit. If I'm doing it with seniors, I bring the Monsters Are Due on Maple Street into it. And I'm like, okay, now here you have this science fiction piece where people are saying the worst enemy isn't hysteria at all. It's people. And they have to take all three then and say, okay, what is the solution here? And if it scares you a little bit, the most common analysis that I got from students was there are things to be afraid of.
Yeah.
That's the most common analysis I got over 15 years of teaching that, is that fear and being afraid of things were more paramount than freedom. And my students would regularly say they'd give up freedom for safety.
Really?
Oh, on the regular. That's it. Like whatever it takes in terms of safety. And like I broke down tons of different examples of how, especially like 2018 was a big year for this. We were living in the safest time in the history of the United States, all this stuff, and it didn't matter. People would say, no, it's scary. It didn't matter the background or anything like that. It's scary. And if it meant a little infringement on their American rights, they wouldn't mind as long as they were safe.
Wow.
They love it. So their solution often in terms of like something like Salem witch trials was, well, if you have to break a few eggs, at least you got an omelet. That's it. And so it's this mindset. Like if you take this time period in terms of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, House of Un-American Activities Committee, quite often my students would talk about feeling safer rather than feeling freer. And they were like, they were always interested. Well, how many communists did they actually catch? I'm like, they caught communists. And they're like, good. I'm like, well, wait a second. What about all the people that weren't communists? And they're like, at least they got the commies.
What?
Yeah. Just as a little like, and I mean, it's a social experience. It's obviously anecdotal.
Oh yeah. I'm not judging.
I'm teaching in a primarily white, primarily rural, primarily poor school. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is the definition of anecdotal data. I'm not making claims on any of this.
Oh yeah, and I don't think you are, and I want to say that on right now as you're doing. I'm not taking that at all. I'm taking it's kids, and I get it, and kids. I think our children's brains are just adults too, but more so, kids are always more about safety, being safe, feeling safe than free, essentially, because they don't understand freedom at that age.
They truly don't know the definition of it. And what I would do is often pull in data from post 9/11 about flying. So the Patriot Act, right? We enact the Patriot Act post 9/11, reduces a lot of personal freedoms for Americans. No level of safety has been proven statistically to have been gained from it. It hasn't changed. So all of the laws that we enact post 9/11 had no statistical impact on actual safety. And data suggests heavily that people fear things more than they ever did prior to 9/11.
Yeah.
So not only are they not feeling safer, they are physically the same. Okay. So I provide them with this data and having them break it down and look at it and read it. And quite often they're like, well, at least we're trying to make people safer. And I like, they don't care. They didn't care too much about at what cost. I often wonder, like, if they had been president in the 1950s, they probably would have been like signing up for local neighborhood watch. And this happened, local neighborhood watches, to make sure people weren't having, their communist parties. And so on a Friday night, if you're having a cocktail party in your house, you might have Dale next door knocking on your front door saying, Mick, are you guys like registered communists in here? I mean, the phrase from HUAC, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Like, There's a lot of parallels to be drawn between the time periods, I think. Like, people, when they fear things and they don't understand things, they kind of resort to whatever the forcible method is to contain it. And so if you put it in terms of history, it really comes down to the difference of whether or not you are what's called a Hobbesian kind of person who doesn't mind what's called a Leviathan, a single central ruler that tells everybody what to do, or if you would prefer a much more freedom-based approach where people actually have a lot of individual freedoms in terms of it, and that's John Locke. John Locke argued that individuals should always have more freedom than groups. Mm-hmm. And it's this real kind of like delineation. The time period you look at it, so funny because people see the 1950s as the freest point of, the United States. They're like, man, if we could only be back in the 1950s, which I think Miranda would have something to say about that. But like they see it as the freest time period. The reality is that it's probably the closest that we've ever come in our country to treading into fascist territory. There was a lot of heavy-handed, heavy hammer laws going on, and HUAC wasn't above basically black bagging people. Now, it wasn't quite the same. It was like, figuratively black bagging people, but overnight you would lose so many personal freedoms and even end up outside of the United States and not able to return solely because of this committee's power.
Really? And
that's fascism. The decision making as a whole for the state being better than the individual. That's fascism 101. So in a lot of ways, if you study the 1950s, if you study how this operated, and what's funny is it wasn't like big political entities either. It's not like Joseph McCarthy. He was just a big name. He was a senator. This isn't presidents. This isn't like generals. This isn't, usually fascism comes from the military. This is more like bureaucratic fascism, which I think is more dangerous. If you ever seen the movie Brazil, is like a great example of what I'm talking about. Like bureaucratic fascism, 1950s. There's your next master's thesis if you're looking for it out there, people.
You know what? I love that, and that's a great way to put it. And having learned so much as I kind of keep going along with everything, it's been interesting to see just how much of an effect. And like you said, like people have always said, 1950s, let's go back to that, blah, blah, blah. And then you think about it and you think about where something like this, that was like, it's not a true epidemic, but really is. It's the government attacking people and making them turn on themselves, And
often, I mean, it's not like people were elected to the HUAC. They would be appointed within our legislative body. So this isn't a democratically elected entity making decisions about stuff going on, whether it's Hollywood or otherwise. Press especially, like, oh my gosh, if you got labeled in this in terms of like the press, this was an attack on the freedom of the press, which is one of our inalienable rights that is outlined in the U.S. Constitution. They, as having slightly sympathetic tendencies towards communism, you have unelected officials, because I mean, they're elected to their position, but they're not elected to this body.
True.
Bringing you in front of them and then basically saying, prove you're not a communist. How do you prove a negative? You can't. Fascism 101. Like there's this really, really good book out there. I think the guy's name is Bertram Bernard or something like that. He wrote a book called Friendly Fascism. And like he outlines exactly how this bureaucratic kind of fascism happens. It's something that goes unseen, unheard. It's these committees that essentially, nowadays they'll call it the shadow government. Like that's what I'm really talking, is like the unelected positions that are staying in their position to hold power, only to hold power. And like it happens more often than you'd think. HUAC is one really good example of it in history. Another are like to be a certain way. Like, do you really like your committee in the 1990s investigating steroids in baseball? Do we pay taxes for them to intervene in a public sport? That's another example of it. Like, now it's obviously much smaller than HUAC, right? But like, it's another example of this kind of bureaucratic fascism that takes place. And like, I mean, Joseph McCarthy, he kind of like styled himself as a pseudo-fascist too. You know, he wasn't above violating the freedom of press. He wasn't above violating people's secrecy. He wasn't above, like, he would go out of his way to attack anybody who said he was full of shit.
Jesus. Well, you know, I gotta say, I mean, I really appreciate this. Is like a lot of insight, and that's really helping. I'm like writing down notes as you're talking, because like, it's such an interesting time, and I know a lot about it, but at the same time, like how in depth, and I love being able to talk to you about it and learn more. Before like we kind of wrap things up, I would love to ask you, for you, what do you think the biggest legacy or footprint that McCarthyism has left on this country, and maybe a positive and a negative?
So I literally wrote down here on my notes, like, cultural impact. Okay, two things. One, it left a lasting imprint on Hollywood and the broader American landscape, okay? For two reasons. One, it underscores the vulnerability of the First Amendment. And if you're out there thinking that any other amendment of our Constitution is more important than our first one, I'm telling you, you're wrong. I've said it wrong. I've said it to plenty of students. I'll say it to anybody that's listening. It's more important than your right to bear arms. It's more important than all of it. Because without your First Amendment right, you can't defend any other, okay?
Yeah, I love when people argue. And I don't mean to interrupt you or interject, because I really want to hear your point on this, but like I love when people say that, because I hear that quite a bit too. And as I think about it, and I'm like, what are you talking? Like what are we really talking about here? Are you really saying this right now?
Yeah,
like,
well, it's because people immediately assume the right to freedom of speech is like, I can say whatever I want. And that's not what the freedom of speech is. Like, the freedoms associated with speech have so much more to do with like being able to carry out ideas without fearing reprise from your government. And that's truly what it is. It's a thought, to put it in 1984 terms, like it's protecting you from thought crime. It's what it does. It protects you from thought. Okay. And hey, you want to study anything in terms of communism or fascism in the history of the world? You know what the first thing they do? They take away is the freedom of press. That's the first thing. Great example again from Animal Farm. The first thing that happens is the pigs take over printing information and writing it on the side of the barn. That's the first thing they do.
You own the information. You own the world.
You own the information. Second part is this, and I think this is probably like, this is the big thing that I would talk constantly to students about. And granted, I'm an English teacher, right? But history is my background. Unchecked power, no matter what it is dangerous. Power by its own right will corrupt people. It doesn't matter who it is, whether you're talking about Joseph McCarthy getting the slightest bit of power from Wisconsin, of all places, and then running with it, or you're talking about your local, like one person in your local area who happens to have like enough real estate that they make decisions for everybody else in your neighborhood. Unchecked power by virtue of its existence is a bad thing, and you should fear anybody who says the following three words: just trust me. Don't, like, it. The harder somebody argues that they're trustworthy, and this is my students be like, well, what if we tell you don't trust me? I say, good, I'm a powerful entity. I have control over this classroom. Like, question my authority at all turns. Please do. Like, you should always question authority no matter what form it takes, because if it's not questioned and carried through with the First Amendment, it's dangerous. You have to be able to criticize governmental entities, no matter who they are. And I would argue that it's our job as American citizens to criticize powerful people. It's like your civil job to do so.
And I think the funny thing, and this is just an observation personally, of, you know, research through history and such, and to seeing what today's trends are and things like that, I really feel like we've been buying this bill of goods for so long, as in just trust your government. They're there. They're here to protect you. And then we've been buying into it. Even our generation too, like 80s was ridiculous, and even 90s and so on. But now I'm starting to see, like, even what is it, Generation Z, the new generation, or Generation Alpha, or whatever it is,
the newest ones.
They're just kind of, I think they got so screwed over by, I don't know, maybe certain presidents saying believe me or trust me all the time, that they're just kind of like, no, we don't trust any of you.
It's like, here's the other part though. Like, so you don't trust the people, you trust the system.
True.
Okay. I've said it to every student I can when they freak out, no matter what election it was. I taught all the way from Bush 2 all the way through our current president, President Biden. And at every election, this is what I'll tell you: at every election out there, your kids, who, like, at any point, if you had kids during elections, they were scared about what was happening. At anyone, like, I could show you a kid that was scared when President Obama was elected. There were students that were scared. When President Trump was elected, there were people that were scared. When President Biden was elected, no matter who, I'm telling you, individuals were scared no matter what. Okay. Yeah. Now, there are people that also trusted those entities. I'm saying you need to find the middle ground between it and understand that the American system, though imperfect, is still the best version of what exists. It's a foundational system that our founding fathers created to check power. And we have, through trial and error, really understood how to navigate it much better. You have to trust the system no matter what. What you need to be afraid of is when, and this is a current trend that's happened pretty much since really President Reagan, too many presidents are willing to use what's called executive privilege. Mm-hmm. That those actions they take with executive privilege bypass Congress. And that's what you don't want. You want all three bodies of our government competing with each other. This is the Madisonian federalism view that takes place. If you go back to the Silence Do Good letters previous to the inception of our country, the Madisonian view of competing entities within government was interwoven in those letters. And, Madison said this. He was like, competition for power is always good because it checks it makes it uncorruptible, really. Mm-hmm. Because when one entity carries themselves too far, there's always somebody else to catch them.
Yeah.
Now, there are people out there that are frustrated with their government right now. Okay. That's what's beautiful about our government is if you're carrying things through in a non-violent protest kind of way, I'm on your side. Even if I disagree with you, I'm on your side. That's your American right. Yeah. Now, when you start carrying through violently, you might lose me a little bit depending on who you are.
Yeah, and your cause.
That's where it kind of lose me. And like some people, rightfully so, have violently protested throughout time. I will tell you this:
I've seen governments do it, even ours.
Yeah, like it's. I'll say, like, one thing I'll say in the modern age that we don't understand is what true governmental violence is. Mm-hmm. If you look at the women's suffrage movement, I know it's way off topic from HUAC, but if you look at the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century and some of the things that they were willing to do to try to get people's attention, be careful what you wish for in terms of your government, because if we get a repeat of that in terms of minimizing people's voices and suppressing their freedom of speech and suppressing their freedom to pursue that speech, okay, if we're not careful about it, you're going to see a lot worse things than what took place in 2020. You'll see a lot worse things than what you saw take place in 2021. You'll see some real stuff, because that's not real. We haven't seen real social violence, I mean, really, since 1992 with the Rodney King riots.
Yeah,
that's real social violence. Our stuff is kind of soft. Even like storming the Capitol building and taking over like that. I mean, compare that to the LA riots. One, it was quelled in under 4 hours. Two, only I think 2 people died, or 1 person died and 1 person was severely injured, something like that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think we quite understand what governmental violence is. And so taking away the lessons from something like HUAC, understand that if you sign up for people's freedoms to be infringed upon, you have to be ready for the inevitable backlash that comes on the backside of it. Had HUAC continued through to gain power and not be just, I mean, it was like the king has no clothes kind of situation, right? Had it not been for people seeing through the charade, who knows what would have happened with it.
I'd even posit, looking at today compared to, yesteryear and the things that come in governmental violent protests and things like that, I would say like we're on a track. I think hopefully we can get off that track. Hopefully we can.
Nice.
And I would agree. We, especially compared to 1992 and, that whole everything, how everything went down. And I completely get it. But even seeing like the Black Lives Matters movement, it isn't the LA right. So like to me, it's like it's evolved into something better, in my opinion. And
Well, I mean, there were violent parts. Don't get me wrong. Like all the protests.
Absolutely.
I mean, we had it take place in Lansing. Like people smashed windows in, and like I mean, we were scared enough in our house that we're close enough. We're within a mile of like a lot of the violence that took place that we were considering evacuating. Like, so it's not that it hasn't been or had violent parts. It's that we've gotten better at expressing ourselves in a way that is nonviolent. So we have to be careful what we wish for, and we have to be careful about whose rights we are impeding and treading upon, because there's always going to be a pendulum that swings back and forth. The harder or stronger power goes in one direction. I mean, look at the 1950s. They gave birth to the freedom movement of the 1960s. Yeah. Without the pseudo-fascism that took place that I talked about, you don't see the rise of hippie culture. You don't see the folk movement. You don't see all of that happen in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Everything is a pendulum that swings back and forth. So the second you get somebody in power and you think that you're right, understand that there is a group of people out there that think you're wrong. So you need to treat the group that thinks you're wrong better than you want to be treated. Because if you treat them poorly, you are creating an enemy. And that's a Sun Tzu right there. You want to pull in some, Eastern culture into it. Sun Tzu. The worse you treat your enemy, the worse your enemy will come to collect on you. So you have to be cautious about how you do this. You have to be cautious about oppositions. We got lucky in the 1950s in terms of this, in large part because it faded away in the 1960s and early 70s. But it also gave a warning. Are we listening to warnings right now? Are we listening to the people that feel marginalized? Are we listening to the people that are on the fringes? Yeah. I don't know.
Well, actually, that to kind of tie this all together and bring it back to Hollywood, how much would you say?
That was a little meandering there.
Well, no, I love it, and it all kind of comes together and shows you just exactly how big of an effect.
You can't move one piece in history without moving another piece. Yeah. I mentioned the women's suffrage movement. I mean, in a way, that directly leads into this because post-women's suffrage movement and post-World War I, there was a huge fear that took place that too many people were getting power. That's why women after World War I went back to the house. They went right back to the house. They didn't, you don't see the rise of women again until we need them to build bullets. And then post 1945, they never put the vote back in the box, so to speak. Women then were out and they were garnering more freedom than ever. And so you see a suppression of women in the 1920s and 30s that goes hand in hand with this kind of pseudo bureaucratic fascism that I was talking about. They were afraid of women. They were just as afraid of women as they were afraid of communists.
As they should be.
They watch it. Your wife's going to throw a shoe.
No, listen, hey, they're tough. They give birth. We are just a bunch of whiny little babies. No, I will say this though, tying it back into Hollywood and the blacklist, the Hollywood blacklist, the Hollywood 10 that were
we didn't even get the 10. I'm sorry.
Blacklisted. And and we're gonna cover it right here. This is where we close out because I wanted to bring it back to Hollywood. Those 10 men, they were so, because of the fame, because of what came with it and such and who they were. This is just my feeling on it from the research I've done, and I'd love for you to correct me or just please elaborate more. Those 10 men, I would say, were probably instrumental in tearing down the strength of Joseph McCarthy and the H.U.A.C. because they were in the forefront. They were but also because they tricked the system when they got back out and were still making money, still winning awards, especially Dalton Trumbo winning 2 Oscars.
Yep.
And he couldn't put his name on it, So how do you feel that the Hollywood 10 and the blacklist and had its effect on maybe ending the H.U.A.C's run in that time?
I think that one of the before really those kind of figures, I do want to point this out, there were people in Hollywood that were sympathetic to HUAC. I do want to point that out. That's it. Whether you're talking about Elia Kazan or Ronald Reagan, there were people that were sympathetic to this anti-communist kind of hysteria. As far as those 10 go, and I'm pretty sure, wasn't Humphrey Bogart one of them too?
I think Humphrey Bogart was called in. I don't know if he was a name. I don't think he gave names. I know Edward G. Robinson did.
Okay.
Elia Kazan is like one of the bigger names that was giving names.
Yep. In terms of these friendly witnesses and everything going on, and like I'd say a great parallel, and like right now you see these really wealthy people in Hollywood that are contributing to the writer's strike. Like they're donating to the people, making sure they can pay their rent, making sure they can eat, stuff like that. I would say that the 10 really kind of parallel in terms of that. Like it's crazy because like you have these individuals who I want to know, where was everybody else? Like it's the same thing in terms of like the writer's strike right now that's going on, is like you see these people like, Tom Hanks bought sandwiches for everybody while they were picketing. Like, why isn't everybody else doing that? Why wasn't everybody else trying to speak it? Like fear. I mean, I don't know. It's so hard. But the other part is that, I mean, like I said before, there were people that were sympathetic to it. So maybe, I don't know, a silent majority were actually more sympathetic to HUAC than we study from history, maybe?
I would definitely say after the fear, especially most of those men, not just in Hollywood, all over, serving, coming home. The MPA, of course, was hugely backing the H.U.A.C. I wonder how much funding was going into these things to help back. I mean, John Wayne, of course, was like the poster boy for all of that. And then you had other, writers and such, like media folk who were.
My notes here say, and I didn't realize this, at the time, Ronald Reagan was the head of the Screen Actors Guild.
And he was very much.
And he was very sympathetic to HUAC.
Yeah. I mean, he not just sympathetic, he was like.
He would be ready to name names and stuff. So I guess like when your own guild is kind of like, okay. I mean, there's where they were, So you have these 10 brave people kind of like serving as a shield, I guess. It's so crazy.
I mean, something like that, and just even to speculate on this, like think about how much money transfers hands. If you're going to the studios, if I'm the studio and I'm saying, okay, these guys are loud, they're communists, you can have them, but like I make money off these stars. Now you can scare them, and if they give you names, great, but I need to make money off of them.
Okay.
If I were to just guess based on like an educated guess of having worked in the industry and know people in studio executive level, I could see them doing it.
Well, I mean, we just saw it happen with Ezra, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right. So yeah. Like here you see these 10, and they're kind of like dying on the shield, so to speak, for everybody.
The 50s is when we really learned about Eddie Mannix and the fixers of Hollywood who were out there working for the studios, trying to keep these celebrities in line so they were wholesome and everybody loved them. While you have HUAC doing that, so there has to be involvement. Like, I mean, and again, this is the speculation part, people. This isn't the story part.
I'm not up to date in terms of the actual, like, I know the history. You probably know the actual industry stuff better than I do, because
they'll sell you over, no problem.
Yeah, like it. So yeah, I guess like you see these 10 dying on the shield, so to speak. But really, like you said, like if you were making money, they'll send you to scare you, but they're still gonna cast you in their movie in 3 weeks. So yeah, okay, there's where they were. I haven't really thought of that too much yet.
So you never know who was what, where, why, or when at the time. But like, if the Hollywood 10 did anything, and it's helping to not tear down, of course they didn't tear it down, but they fought the beast and they brought it down.
Yeah, I mean,
that aspect of it.
You see visible people with some sort of clout. It's almost like they're spokespeople. I think that's a good metaphor to use for it. They're, Jordan on the front of Wheaties, or, here you see them saying like, maybe there isn't as much to fear as people think there is. And which is a shame. Well, think about all the people that had to bury, like whether it's Trumbo writing, like what do they call it when you write under a pseudonym in Hollywood?
Oh yeah, he wrote under Robert Rich for The Brave.
Yeah. Like it. So you have these people hiding out. I don't know. I really wish I knew more about the actual industry part of it. Like I know a lot about the legal side and the legislation in terms of like the people, but that industry stuff, it's kind of crazy to think about. And of course I immediately want to ask myself, like, how did the mafia, which had so like much power in the United States during this time period, how much did they leverage their influence on Hollywood to make sure certain people were pointed out and certain people weren't? And how much was actually navigated in terms of this money that you're talking about? Like, were certain people steered? So if you were the head of United Artists, did you steer HUAC towards certain actors and actresses because
And think about which studios had more money, because it wasn't the studio system. It was still in effect, but it kind of went away in the 40s.
Yep.
But it still existed. There were still contracts between studios and such. It wasn't as free, I think, as everybody likes to believe, once, because I did a video on the studio system and when it ended. But so it wasn't as free as I think everybody wanted to believe it was. So when this happened, how many studios are saying, well, I need that actor to go to court and like have a bad
we're
name.
producing a picture that's the same as theirs, but it's going to come out 3 weeks later. I heard Mick Manhattan had connections with, you know, some socialists down on Long Beach, and maybe you should investigate him. Like, that'd be something really to delve into.
Yeah,
man, that's like I haven't really. You haven't. Oh, I'm not gonna write. I can't. It's, you know, like I said, you know so much more about the actual industry than I do. I mean, you've been familiar with like all the shows I come on, and I can't remember an actor and actress's name, and like I did. So I guess to really kind of wrap it up, I'll just say like you have one of the scariest time periods in history.
Yeah.
That represents that bureaucratic fascism that I was talking about being defeated. That's the strongest part that I want to leave. It's like hysteria didn't win out.
Yeah.
Better sense and more moderation won the day. So if you're going to take anything away and learn anything from the time period, it's that moderation is the key component to making our system run. And it keeps people like Joseph McCarthy and entities like HUAC in check if you don't let extremes run wild. So even though they're out there saying be afraid of like these communists, because the communists are extremes, HUAC itself was an extreme entity. So no matter who it is, if they're an extreme entity, you should fear them. And you should check their power by criticizing.
Love it. That, you know what? I'm going to leave it at that. Dan, thank you so much for jumping on and doing this with me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. This is, of course, the Dan cut. You can go check out the regular cut too, but it's just the same without Dan. And why would you ever want to do that? But thank you, Dan, so much for being a part of this.
I appreciate it, Mick. And anytime, man, I love going down history lane with people. So anytime you need the historical perspective, I'm more than willing.
Well, it's a good thing I have a weekly show about history now. All right, guys, until next time, keep watching the video. And thank you again, Dan. I want to thank Dan for coming on the show today and talking to me more in depth about McCarthyism and its effect in Hollywood. I want to appreciate you guys watching at home. And listen, next time you're watching a classic flick from the 1950s or before, just remember the untold stories, the resilience, and the battles off screen. Because these things matter, and it helps shape how we do things today and how we take in entertainment. Could you imagine if everything was controlled in that way? No, we stood up and we fought against somebody trying to censor us. Even today, we see the remnants of things like the McCarthy era and how we see the Senate going after things like TikTok and other apps. Now, I'm not saying there's not bearing in going and having hearings like that, but censorship is a real thing that we have to worry about. And although McCarthyism isn't the start, using fear as a way to get over on people, it still echoes today, and we still see it all the time. So it's important to learn this stuff. Thank you so much for joining Snobs Film History. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Go check out other episodes. Make sure to hit like on this video. It helps us go a long way. Hit subscribe to the channel and that little bell, because then you'll know when new episodes of Snobs Film History and so many more are coming out. Thanks again. I'm Mick Manhattan. Remember to be kind, stay groovy, and I will talk to you guys very soon. Take care, movie snobs.